Paul first realized his comfort in his quiet neighborhood was more fragile than it seemed on a chilly autumn evening. The sun had already set, and he was getting ready to head to bed when he noticed something amiss. The front doorknob was smeared with what looked like someone's dirty handprint. His heart kicked into a faster rhythm. Under the porch light, that single smear stood out, a grimy reminder that not everyone in the neighborhood was content to simply stroll by. The next morning, he resolved to get more serious about home security. Though the neighborhood had rarely seen more than the occasional mailbox prank, the smudge on the handle unsettled him enough to act. He combed through multiple online reviews, consulted a few acquaintances, and decided on a discreet security camera system that a local tech shop sold. He paid extra for cloud-based storage and an accompanying mobile app, wanting to ensure he could check the feed even when he wasn't home. The cameras were small and relatively easy to hide, perfect for giving him peace of mind without reminding every visitor they were being recorded. Paul, in his late 20s, worked as a freelance graphic designer. Most days, he divided his time between digital sketches for clients and personal illustration projects. The creative aspect kept him inspired, but the solitary nature of his routine let him cultivate certain private habits. One of those habits involved cross-dressing. Whenever he had downtime, he would indulge in dressing as Paula. On those days, he wore light makeup, a simple wig that fell just above his shoulders, and comfortable dresses that fit his tall, lean frame. These items were his way of experiencing a different perspective within his own home, a form of expression he mostly kept secret, except in a few private online forums. Though he sometimes ventured out for walks in quiet parts of town late at night, he had never fully revealed this part of himself to his everyday circle. Discretion felt safer. He installed 2 cameras, one in the living room, angled toward the front door, and another by the driveway to capture anyone approaching from the outside. Once he confirmed they were working, he checked footage for a couple of days, found nothing unusual, and eventually returned to his normal schedule. His routine lulled him into a sense of security. The cameras were so small he scarcely remembered they existed. Their faint green lights blended into the decor, and he began to treat them like any other household fixture that quietly did its job. Then came one evening when the weight of the day's tasks wore him out enough that he wanted to unwind in the most comfortable way he knew. He was home alone, the living room curtains drawn, and he felt that familiar desire to slip into his alternate persona. It was an impulse that had been building all day. A gently flowing dress waited in his bedroom closet, one he had purchased online a few months earlier. Its color was a deep burgundy, a shade that always reminded him of autumn leaves. He stepped into it and zipped it up carefully. On his head, he placed a wig that had a natural brown tone, just different enough from his own hair color to provide him that sense of transformation. After touching up a bit of foundation and slipping on a comfortable pair of flats, he took a moment to look in the bedroom mirror. Yes, Paula was here. He felt a small rush of relief. Then he carried a cup of chamomile tea into the living room and sank into the couch. He turned on an old sitcom that he loved. Laughter and scripted banter filled the room, blending seamlessly with the hush of the night. He rarely felt more relaxed than he did in those moments, wrapped in the calm presence of an evening at home. He even reached for his phone and started playing a puzzle game, occasionally glancing back at the TV for comedic highlights. At one point, he got up to stretch his legs, turning in place, letting the skirt of the dress swirl gently around his knees. He admired how the fabric moved. Then he settled back onto the couch. It was just a peaceful night, or so he thought. The camera, however, captured everything. Positioned in a corner of the living room, it recorded his every move in crystal clear resolution. Paul's mind, though, had relegated that camera to near invisibility, so he thought nothing of it. It was only there for security, after all, and it rarely crossed his thoughts. He eventually turned off the lights, made sure the doors were locked, and headed to bed. The next morning, he woke up, changed into his usual jeans and hoodie attire, stored away his cross-dressing items, and carried on as though nothing unusual had taken place. A few weeks later, Paul started experiencing issues with his home network: slow speeds, repeated disconnections, and an endlessly blinking router light. It was an annoyance that made his work, and especially his frequent video calls with clients, an obstacle course of dropped signals. After fighting with it for days and even replacing a few cables, he finally decided to reach out to Chris, a longtime friend from college who worked in IT. Chris was the sort of person who lit up when discussing anything to do with code or networks. They'd met in a computer lab during their sophomore year, and while their life paths had diverged since graduation, they had remained close. Chris was in his late 20s as well, sporting short, slightly wavy hair and an unassuming style. "Hey, got a minute?" Paul texted one evening, exasperated after yet another internet drop during a crucial client meeting. Chris responded within seconds. "Sure. Everything okay?" Paul explained the technical issues and ended with a simple question. "Any chance you can come over and take a look?" Chris was more than happy to help, as Paul had done him a favor a few months earlier by designing his small consulting business's logo at a deep discount. They made plans for Chris to stop by on a Saturday afternoon with the intention to run some diagnostics and see if they could identify the culprit behind Paul's spotty connection. When Saturday came, Paul cleared a space in the living room for Chris's laptop and network diagnostic equipment. The living room was still as warm and welcoming as always, though Paul did glance at the small camera in the corner once or twice, reminded of its presence by the mention of technical troubleshooting. He quickly shook off the thought and focused on greeting Chris at the door. They started with the basics: rebooting the router, checking the internet speed on different devices, inspecting cables for any visible damage. Nothing conclusive came up. Chris then connected his laptop directly to the router, accessing more detailed logs. The two of them chatted casually as Chris scrolled through lines of data. Snippets of old jokes from their college days punctuated the conversation, along with the occasional exasperated groan at cryptic error messages. They found some suspicious timestamps that indicated potential service drops from the provider's end, but they didn't want to jump to conclusions. Chris mentioned, "It might help to see if your camera's data feed has been stable. Sometimes these security cameras can hog bandwidth or show exactly when the service cut out, especially if they upload constantly to the cloud." "Right," Paul agreed. "I have it set to record continuously. I forgot I could check that." He motioned to the small camera discreetly mounted in the corner. "The feed is all stored online. I haven't really looked at it in a while, but you can probably see if it's been disconnecting." Chris nodded. "Let's log into your camera app or however you access the feed. Then we can cross-reference that with the times your router logs show interruptions." They proceeded to log into Paul's security system account using Chris's laptop. The interface displayed a chronological list of timestamps and short video clips, mostly triggered by routine movements. Chris began skimming through them. For the first few minutes, it was uneventful. Footage of Paul walking to the kitchen, or a few glimpses of him passing in and out of the front door on various days. The conversation continued to flow normally as they half watched the screen and half checked the rotor logs. Chris clicked a timestamp from a few days back. The footage came up. There was Paul on the couch, sipping from a mug, wearing a burgundy dress. Paul's features were unmistakable, though the wig and outfit changed his overall presentation. At first glance, Chris blinked rapidly, the mental gears spinning to ensure he was really seeing what he thought he was seeing. On screen, Paul shifted, adjusting the hem of the dress, crossing his legs as a TV played in the background. It was about 20 seconds of footage. Chris's eyes widened, hands momentarily frozen on the trackpad. He instinctively glanced at Paul, who was leaning over the laptop with him, but Paul had briefly stepped away to grab a pen from the nearby desk. In those few moments, Chris suddenly felt like an intruder in the worst possible way. He quickly dragged the scrubber forward, skipping past that block of footage, but the system jumped to another clip from that same evening, revealing a slightly different angle of Paul brushing a strand of the wig away from his face. In that second clip, it was absolutely clear who it was and what he was wearing. There was no ambiguity. A wave of discomfort washed over Chris. He wasn't sure how to handle this discovery. His friend had clearly not mentioned this aspect of his life. The last thing Chris wanted was to embarrass Paul or betray his trust. His mind flew through half a dozen possible ways to respond before he realized his friend was about to return. Paul stepped back, pen in hand. "Did you find something?" Chris's voice stuck in his throat. Might have. Let me just..." He swiftly closed the video window. "We can check the raw connection data. I think I saw something, but I'm not sure if it's relevant to the disconnection." Paul nodded, unaware. "Sure. Let me know what you need." Chris thought he'd perhaps successfully covered the slip, but a flicker of confusion crossed Paul's face when he noticed Chris's pallor and a tension in the air that wasn't there a few seconds prior. Still, Paul didn't press him about it. He waited while Chris tapped through different sections of the security app, focusing now on a connectivity graph to see if the service had dropped. Chris's nerves hummed. He wondered if Paul might have any clue that the camera had recorded him in private attire. But Paul's calm expression suggested otherwise. Once Chris finished gathering the relevant data, he exited the security system interface. There was a telling hush in the room, and Paul looked at his friend quizzically. The two men exchanged a short, awkward glance that seemed to confirm that something unspoken had taken place. However, Paul was still in the dark about the footage. He assumed maybe Chris had found personal financial info or something else private, but he didn't know about that day in the burgundy dress. Eventually, Chris said, "Well, from these logs, it looks like your connection is dropping around midnight and again in the late afternoon. You might need to contact your provider about it because it doesn't seem to be on your end. Let me run one more check." Paul shrugged. "Thanks. Yeah, I'll do that." He paused, scanning Chris's face. "Everything okay, though? You look like you've seen a ghost." Chris forced a small chuckle that didn't sound quite natural. "I'm all right. Just realized I didn't eat lunch," he fibbed. "Mind if I grab some water?" "Go ahead." Paul nodded. He watched Chris walk to the kitchen, shoulders slightly tense. "I have some leftover pizza if you're hungry," he called out, trying to lighten the mood. Chris poured a glass of water from the filter in the fridge. "Sure, maybe in a bit." They continued to work together for another half hour. Paul tried to bring back their usual friendly banter, but he felt an odd distance from Chris that wouldn't clear. Finally, with the data collected, Chris packed up his things. "You probably just have to talk to your internet provider," Chris repeated, heading for the door. "If it's not that, we might need to upgrade your router or something like that. Keep me posted." Paul walked him out, still unsure why the atmosphere had changed so suddenly. "Thanks, man. I appreciate it." They exchanged a quick side hug. Then Chris drove off. In the wake of his friend's departure, Paul was left with an uneasy feeling. Chris had discovered something or seen something. That much felt clear. But what could it have been? Paul wandered back to the living room, his eyes drifting over the electronics they had been using. He checked the security app himself, just in case, and realized what might have happened. The Paula footage was right there, under the stored clips. His pulse sped up, and his stomach twisted with worry. He clicked on the clip from the night he wore that burgundy dress. The phone's screen lit up with a crisp shot of him settling onto the couch, fully dressed in attire he never revealed to most friends. His heart pounded. How had he forgotten that the camera was filming? It was plain as day. He stared at the screen, replaying that brief scene. The timeline was only a few days old, so it must have been near the top of the feed when Chris skimmed through. Everything in his friend's behavior over the last hour suddenly made sense. Paul felt faint, bracing a hand on the back of the sofa. Chris knew. He saw me, Paul thought to himself. He had no clue how Chris felt about it, whether he was freaked out, appalled, curious, or some combination. A sense of dread welled up, although a part of him also felt relief. Maybe it was better than lying about who he was. Yet the fear overshadowed that fleeting thought. Paul remained standing in the living room, paralyzed for what felt like a long time. He didn't sleep well that night. The next day he considered calling Chris to clear the air, but every time he picked up his phone, he couldn't find the words. "So you probably saw me dressed in a wig and a dress." Didn't exactly feel easy to drop into conversation. He typed a series of text messages, all of which he abandoned. Then he tried to distract himself with client work, but his mind kept drifting back to that moment. He replayed Chris's expression, that uncertain look, the abrupt change in mood. Perhaps Chris would never bring it up again. Perhaps it would just exist between them, an unspoken secret. That idea weighed heavily on Paul's mind. On Tuesday, Paul's phone buzzed in the late afternoon. A simple text from Chris. "Hey, how's the network holding up?" The message was friendly enough, but Paul could tell it was likely a pretext to open communication again. He stared at it for a few minutes before replying. "It's okay. Still glitchy though. Might call the ISP tomorrow. Thanks again for your help." He expected nothing more. Instead, Chris responded with, "I was wondering if you wanted to grab coffee sometime. There's something I'd like to talk about." Paul's heart stuttered. He reread the line, then typed back, "Sure, when?" They agreed to meet that Friday at a local cafe they both frequented. It was a cozy place with comfortable chairs and a laid-back vibe. Paul found himself dreading the conversation, yet also realizing it was inevitable. He arrived early, snagging a table near a window. He fiddled with his cup, swirling the espresso around while waiting for Chris. When Chris walked in, he gave a slight wave, wearing a polite but subdued expression. They ordered drinks. Chris took a cappuccino, and sat opposite each other, the tension in the air thick enough to be tangible. "How've you been?" Paul ventured, trying to sound casual. Chris managed a tight smile. "Busy with work, you know. It's been a hectic week." A silence fell between them. Outside, passers-by strolled along the sidewalk, occasionally glancing into the cafe. Inside, a low hum of chatter filled the background. Finally, Chris cleared his throat. "Look, man, I'm just going to say it. The other day, when I was checking your camera feed, I saw something personal. I really didn't mean to. I was scrubbing through the footage quickly and, well, there it was." Paul ran a hand over his face, momentarily closing his eyes. "I figured. I noticed how you were acting. Then I checked my feed. I realized it must have been that clip." Neither of them spoke for a moment as they stared at their coffee cups. Then Chris said, "I wasn't sure how to bring it up. I was worried you might feel embarrassed or think I was judging you. Honestly, I'm sorry. It's not my place to snoop, even if it was accidental." Paul exhaled, releasing some of the tension he'd been holding for days. "I know you weren't snooping. You were just helping me. I completely forgot the camera was on. I never really planned for anyone to see that side of me." Another pause. Then Chris nodded gently. "I want you to know I'm not upset or anything. I hope it doesn't feel like I'm condemning you or anything like that. I was just surprised, caught off guard." Paul studied Chris's face, trying to detect any undertone of disgust, pity, or confusion. He mostly found curiosity and a bit of concern. "I get it. It's not exactly something I publicize. I've been doing it for a while, though. It's comfortable for me, but I never told anyone." "Ever?" Chris asked. "Well, not exactly never. A few people online, folks who share the same interest, but none of my close friends. I guess it's not something I felt safe discussing." Chris nodded. "I'm sorry you felt like you had to hide it. Really. It's your business, so I don't want to pry, but if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." He paused, sipping his cappuccino. "I was worried that you might think I'm freaking out or gossiping, but trust me, I haven't told a soul. I'm not planning to." Paul's eyes flickered with relief. "I really appreciate that." They took a few moments to sip their drinks. The tension began to loosen, replaced by a sense of mutual understanding. Paul felt a wave of gratitude that Chris was not rejecting him. "So," Chris ventured softly, "how long have you been doing this?" Paul tapped his fingernails lightly against the mug, pondering how to describe the timeline. "It's been a couple of years, mostly in private. It's just something that feels good, wearing dresses, maybe trying on a wig. Sort of a creative outlet, I guess." Chris nodded, carefully choosing his words. "I get it. People have different ways of expressing themselves. If that's your thing, that's cool." Paul managed a small smile. "Thanks." A lull in conversation stretched a moment longer. Finally, Chris set his mug down. "All right, so now that this is out in the open, I just want you to know, we're good. I'm not going to treat you any differently." Paul's shoulders relaxed visibly. "That means a lot. Honestly, I spent all weekend stressing out about it." Chris frowned empathetically. "I'm sorry about that. I wish I could have texted you right away, but I wasn't sure how. I didn't want to just blurt it out and make you uncomfortable." Paul took a breath, releasing the last of the tension that had been coiled in his chest. "I appreciate that you brought it up so we can clear the air. This is a huge weight off my mind." They chatted for another 15 minutes about the network problems, eventually circling back to normal friendship updates. Work, weekend plans, small talk about the local sports team. By the time they parted, it felt like they had made real progress in diffusing the awkwardness. That night, Paul's mind lingered on the conversation, replaying it in detail. He felt an unexpected sense of relief. Though he still harbored anxiety about anyone else discovering his cross-dressing, at least one friend now knew, and it had not destroyed their relationship. In fact, Chris seemed genuinely open to hearing more if Paul ever felt comfortable sharing. Over the next few weeks, the two friends went back to their usual habits, hanging out occasionally, sending each other memes, complaining about work. The tension from that afternoon in the living room seemed to have evaporated. Paul found himself feeling lighter. However, he couldn't help but wonder if it would ever come up again, or if Chris would have further questions. It was the following month when Chris invited Paul over for a casual get-together. A few other friends were going to be there, basically a mini potluck where everyone contributed a dish. Paul decided to show up with homemade spinach dip and a bag of artisan bread. As he arrived at Chris's apartment, he realized he was stepping into a scenario that had once made him nervous. He felt uncertain if Chris would act strangely in front of others, possibly hinting at Paul's private life. But as soon as he walked in, Chris greeted him with an enthusiastic hug and took the spinach dip with a flourish, crowing about how much he loved the stuff. The evening passed uneventfully. Laughter, drinks, and easy conversation filled the space. There was no sign that Chris had betrayed Paul's confidence. He was simply the same friend he'd always been. Eventually, the night wound down and the other guests left. Paul lingered behind to help Chris tidy the kitchen. As they loaded dishes into the dishwasher, Chris glanced at Paul. "Hey, can I ask you something?" he said. His tone was casual, not tense. Paul set a glass in the dishwasher rack. "Sure, shoot." Chris leaned against the counter. Remember our talk at the cafe? Paul's cheeks warmed slightly. Yeah, I remember. Well, I was just curious. Have you done it again recently? You know, wearing the dresses and all that. Paul raised his eyebrows slightly, unsure why Chris was asking. I have a couple of times. It's something I do regularly, but only when I'm sure I've got time alone. Chris nodded in a thoughtful way. Cool. I just wanted to make sure you weren't avoiding it or something because of what happened. Paul found himself smiling a little. I appreciate that, but I'm not going to stop. It's part of who I am, just something I do. Chris nodded in acknowledgement. Awesome, that's all. Thanks for being honest. They finished putting away the dishes and moved to the living room, where the conversation shifted to random topics until Paul decided to head home. On his drive back, he processed that brief exchange. He found it quietly supportive that Chris cared enough to check whether that moment of exposure had stifled his personal habits. It was a level of concern Paul never expected from a friend. Another few months passed in a relatively uneventful manner. Paul's freelance work picked up, and he took on new clients from various industries. Chris was busy as well, having landed a large project at work that demanded extra hours. Their visits became less frequent, but they still texted often. One mild winter evening, Chris dropped by to watch a movie. They sprawled on the couch with popcorn and debated which sci-fi film to stream. Midway through, Chris paused the movie to use the restroom. Paul used that moment to check his phone, scanning through messages. When Chris returned, he was standing near the corner of the living room again, eyes roaming momentarily. You know, Chris said, pointing at the small security camera above the TV. I've been thinking about how that camera changed our friendship a bit. Not in a bad way, but in a sense that it revealed something I never would have known otherwise. Paul set his phone aside. Yeah, I guess it did. Funny how technology can do that. Chris shrugged gently. I guess I just want to say that I hope you never felt pressured by me. If you ever want to talk about any of it, you can. If not, that's totally fine. I just want you to be cool with everything between us. Paul felt gratitude surge within him. Thanks, Chris. I'm definitely comfortable. It was weird at first, but you've been really supportive. So yeah, I'm good. Chris offered a warm smile, resumed the movie, and they let the subject rest. Throughout the film, though, Paul's thoughts occasionally wandered. There was a sense of closeness growing between them, a trust that only deepened when two people share a secret. He wondered if this was a turning point in their bond, or just a momentary reflection on what had passed. Time marched on. The burglary scare that had spurred the camera installation was barely a memory now, overshadowed by routine life. Paul considered removing the living room camera a few times. It brought an unease now that it had once exposed him. Yet he decided to keep it, possibly due to the lingering relief that it provided in knowing his home was secure. Still, he became far more meticulous about turning it off whenever he wanted to dress up, or at least pointing it away to preserve his privacy. The next major conversation about it arrived unexpectedly one night, close to spring. Paul had joined Chris and a couple of mutual friends at a pub. After a few drinks, Chris stepped outside with Paul for some fresh air. The evening breeze felt cool on their cheeks, and they lingered on the sidewalk, glancing at passing cars. Chris stuffed his hands into his pockets, glancing at Paul. So, is there anything new going on in your life? His tone was casual, but carried a hint of genuine curiosity. Paul considered whether to share details. Not much. Work steady. I might go to that convention out of state in a couple weeks to meet a client in person. Chris nodded. Nice. How about your personal stuff? Paul hesitated. Chris had never been prying, but the question had a note of genuine interest. I guess I'm all right there. I mean, it's still something I do at home. And yeah, I enjoy it. Has anyone else found out? Chris asked carefully. Paul shook his head. No, just you. And the folks in those online groups, of course. They looked at each other, hearing the muffled sounds of music drifting from inside the pub. Across the street, a few pedestrians laughed as they passed. It was a calm night, the skies clear. Paul felt a sense of vulnerability just standing there under the streetlights, talking about something he'd kept hidden for so long, with a friend who had accidentally discovered it. Chris broke the silence. I'm proud of you for being real with me. He paused, then laughed softly. I know that word sounds corny, sorry, but I do respect that you aren't letting a single slip-up scare you into hiding. Paul felt his face grow warm, but it wasn't from embarrassment this time. Thanks. I appreciate your support. I really do. They rejoined their other friends inside, continuing the night without any fanfare. By the time Paul returned home, he realized that the strangest part of all this was that it no longer seemed strange. Perhaps the biggest surprise was how normal their friendship had become after the initial shock. He wished he'd known sooner that Chris's reaction would be so calm. Late that night, Paul found himself sitting on his bed, flipping through channels on the TV. He let out a slow breath, thinking about how far he'd come in his private journey. The living room camera still perched near the corner, presumably recording. And yet, life moved along. A mere half-year ago, he would have been terrified of being caught on film like that. Now, he felt relief that at least one person in his life knew the truth and remained a steadfast friend. A few weeks later, Paul began receiving more out-of-town job offers. Several potential clients wanted him to handle branding projects that required in-person meetings. Since he worked as a freelancer, this was both exciting and daunting. The prospect meant more travel, maybe even relocating if the work became steady enough. He and Chris were hanging out in Paul's living room on a Sunday afternoon when the topic came up. I'm not sure I want to uproot my life, Paul admitted, pacing around the living room, stepping over scattered sketches. But these opportunities could lead to bigger gigs. Chris, relaxing on the couch, nodded. You've been looking to expand your portfolio for a while. This might be it. True, Paul said, biting his lip. The only real anchor I have here is my circle of friends and, my comfort zone. He gestured vaguely, indicating the space where he felt free to dress how he wanted. Chris got up and walked over to him. You can still do that wherever you go, right? It's not like it's locked to this house. Paul let out a breath and nodded. Yeah, but there's something about my own home, It's like my safe space. Chris offered a sympathetic half-smile. You can create that anywhere, though. And hey, I'll always be a phone call away, no matter where you end up. You're not losing me as a friend. Paul's tension softened a bit. Thanks, man. That means a lot. They ended up ordering takeout and talking about the logistics of traveling for freelance work. Chris encouraged Paul to at least explore the possibility, reminding him that no single decision had to be permanent. By night's end, Paul felt a renewed sense of excitement about the future, even if it meant stepping outside his comfortable bubble. In the weeks that followed, Paul actually traveled to meet a couple of potential clients. He spent a weekend in a nearby city, living out of a small hotel room. One evening, after finishing a day of negotiations, he looked at himself in the mirror. He had that same travel-weary look he always got when juggling flights and hotel living. Part of him missed the feeling of slipping into a dress and watching a sitcom in his living room, but he settled for casual pajamas, deciding that maybe, once he was back home, he'd indulge again. That was the routine. It kept him balanced. When he finally returned, Chris visited to hear all about the trip. They sat in Paul's living room, the sun setting behind the drawn curtains. Paul noticed that the camera was unplugged for the moment. He had decided to keep it off for his own peace of mind whenever he wasn't actively worried about security. He'd grown more cautious since the big reveal. They recounted stories about flight delays, finicky clients, and the general chaos of business travel. Later that night, once Chris left, Paul did exactly what he'd envisioned in that hotel. He took a quick shower and, feeling rejuvenated, went to his closet. He chose a soft lavender dress that he liked almost as much as the burgundy one. Quietly, he slipped it on, tamed his hair, and spent a few minutes humming a tune to himself. Then he went to the couch, turned on a sitcom, and let the comforting sounds fill his living room. He still remembered that sense of shame he'd felt when he realized Chris had seen him like this. Now, he felt something else, a faint glimmer of assurance that, at least for one friend, this was not an issue. In fact, it barely came up in conversation, unless Paul brought it up, or unless Chris was checking on him. It didn't define their friendship. It was a part of Paul's life, but not the sole focus of it. A few days later, Paul and Chris met again to do a routine check on the network, which had still been giving Paul occasional trouble. They were in the living room once more, but this time, Paul had the camera turned on to test if it dropped the signal. Both of them joked that it was a trip back in time to that day of discovery. Even so, there was no awkwardness now. Chris navigated the security system's interface, ironically far more comfortable than before, and repeated his disclaimers that he'd skip any personal footage. Paul smirked, giving him a playful nudge. "I appreciate it," Paul said with a wry grin. "I'd rather not rewatch clips of me strolling around in a dress." Chris chuckled. "Fair enough." Yet the air between them was light. The fear and tension from months ago had dissipated. Eventually, the logs indicated that Paul's ISP was still sporadically cutting out, so they once again concluded it was time to pester the provider. After they finished, they both flopped onto the couch, sipping sodas. Chris stared at the ceiling for a second. "I'm grateful we got all that sorted out," he said, referring not just to the internet, but to the tension that once hung between them. Paul nodded, also gazing upward. "Me too." In the coming months, life rolled on. Paul eventually found a better internet provider and relocated to them. He continued to refine his craft, building a reputation as a graphic designer who could handle both conventional branding and edgier creative projects. Chris spent more time at his IT company, eventually receiving a promotion for his strong performance on the large project. On special weekends, they still met for pizza, movies, or just to catch up. Paul's crossdressing occasionally popped up in small references, but it was no longer a giant elephant in the room. For Paul, the slow unfolding of this new normal felt both surreal and surprisingly mundane. He had always imagined that if someone in his close circle found out about his private hobby, it would catapult him into a storm of judgment or confusion. Yet Chris's discovery had brought little more than a few awkward moments, followed by empathy and acceptance from a friend. That shift in perspective gave Paul a sense of stability. The biggest reminder of how far they'd come arrived the following year, when Chris moved into a new apartment closer to his office. On moving day, Paul helped haul boxes up 2 flights of stairs. By the time they finished, sweat streaked both their brows, and they collapsed on the couch in the half-furnished living room. Surrounding them were piles of boxes, labeled in Chris's neat handwriting. Chris exhaled loudly. "I owe you a huge favor for this, buddy." Paul laughed. "Don't mention it. We're friends, remember?" Chris pulled out his phone, flipping through the notes for his new Wi-Fi setup. "So, I was thinking you could help me set up my network. I know you're not IT, but you're good at hooking things up without making a mess." Paul smirked. "Sure, I'll try, but you're the expert. Don't blame me if I do something that slows your connection." Chris shrugged. "We'll figure it out." They got to work, rummaging through cables and routers, placing them in strategic spots around the apartment. Eventually, the conversation circled back to security cameras. Chris mentioned considering installing one in his new place. Paul grew thoughtful. "Do you really want to record everything you do?" he teased, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness in his voice. Chris shrugged. "I'm thinking about it for the front door at least. But I'll be sure to turn it off or direct it away from the living space if I ever have anyone over who wants privacy." He tossed Paul a knowing glance. Paul nodded, pausing in the middle of sorting cables. "I think that's wise," he said simply. They ended up ordering takeout after hooking up the basics, then collapsed onto the new couch again. The topic shifted to Chris's busy schedule, Paul's upcoming projects, and a dozen other tangents. By night's end, Paul said goodbye, hugging Chris tightly and congratulating him on the new place. As he drove home, Paul reflected on how one moment of technology capturing him in an unguarded state had almost upended his life. Yet it had led him to an unexpected outcome, a closer friendship built on trust. He recognized that the path had been rocky at first. The anxious nights of worrying, the awkward coffee meeting, the halting conversations, they had all played a role. But in the end, having someone see that private side of him and still remain a friend felt like something intangible that strengthened their bond. Paul continued his routine in the months and years to come. He traveled for work sporadically, sometimes for weeks at a time. But whenever he returned to his cozy living room, he might slip on a wig, don a dress, and kick back on the couch for a sitcom marathon. The camera in the corner was sometimes plugged in, sometimes not. Eventually, he found a balance. He learned how to angle it away if he wanted complete privacy, but occasionally he forgot to. In those forgetful moments, he'd remember that once upon a time, Chris had accidentally stumbled across that feed, and everything turned out all right. Their friendship endured. New acquaintances would occasionally join their circle, but only Chris knew about Paula. At times, Paul considered telling a few other trusted companions, but he never felt rushed. He had at least one friend who knew and who treated him no differently. In that fact, he found something akin to a quiet peace. It was enough. Several seasons passed. One crisp evening, Paul was sorting through his closet, rotating out clothes he no longer wore. He found that burgundy dress, the one he'd worn on the night of the recorded footage that started it all. He pulled it out, running his fingers over the fabric. Memories flickered back, the fear, the confusion, the conversation in the cafe, and the eventual resolution. He decided to keep it, folding it neatly and returning it to a special section of the closet, a reminder of that pivotal day. A few hours later, Chris called. He wanted an update on one of Paul's freelance projects. They chatted for a bit, Chris joking about how he was jealous that Paul could work from anywhere. Paul teasingly reminded him that commuting across the city each day wasn't so bad, especially since Chris loved jam sessions with audiobooks. Their conversation drifted on to lighter topics, concluding with a promise to meet for dinner soon. After they hung up, Paul found himself smiling at his phone. He realized he felt profoundly grateful for the friend who had handled such a delicate discovery with more compassion than Paul thought possible. That memory no longer carried the sting of embarrassment. It had become a story they'd occasionally mention as a footnote in their friendship, an accidental moment that revealed something deep and personal, yet ultimately caused them to stand on stronger ground. In the grand scheme of things, the burglary scare that prompted Paul to install a security camera almost felt like a distant footnote. The real impact had nothing to do with thwarting criminals or protecting possessions. Instead, it had forced Paul to confront one of his most private habits, being seen by someone he respected. It had been uncomfortable, raw, and terrifying in the moment. Yet he and Chris emerged from that trial with a shared understanding and a depth of camaraderie that might otherwise have taken years to forge. Months blurred into a year, then another. Paul's career thrived, and Chris found stability and progress in his IT role. Their hangouts became a comforting fixture of routine. On nights when they parted ways, each returning to his own private life, Paul occasionally mused at how a single captured moment could have derailed everything, but instead ended up weaving them closer. He kept the footage in his cloud storage, never quite erasing it, though he never willingly watched it again either. It was the digital footprint of a crucial turning point. One late afternoon, Paul found Chris waiting on his porch, holding a laptop bag and that easy grin. He'd come over for a standard router tweak. Paul couldn't help but laugh at how the setup reminded him of the day they discovered the footage. But this time, neither of them was anxious. "You ready?" Chris asked, waving the bag. "Let's see if your ISP has gotten any better at keeping you connected." "Sure, bring it on," Paul answered, letting him in. They settled into the living room. Once again, the camera perched above, quietly blinking. Paul's eyes flicked to it, then back to Chris, who smirked knowingly. "History repeats itself," Chris joked. "Don't worry, I'm only checking connection logs, not your personal recordings." Paul's laugh was genuine. "Go for it. I trust you." And that was the crux of it. After all the chaos, embarrassment, and apprehension, trust remained. It was a testament to how a friendship could weather an awkward accident and come out stronger on the other side. They dove into the router settings, bantering about the usual comedic lines from their shared college days, pausing occasionally to check the data. The tension that once had them both on edge was gone, replaced by something calm, easy, and real. The camera continued its silent watch, capturing nothing more dramatic than two friends working side by side, forging ahead in a world that had room enough for each of them and their private truths.
Did you like the story? Hit that like button and tell me what you thought in the comments. Do you want to hear more stories? Subscribe and hit the bell. For exclusive content and early access, check out our Patreon. You can find the link in the description, or you can watch any of the videos shown on my right. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.